A quorum being present, the Committee on Homeland Security will be in order. The committee is meeting today for consideration of H.R. 5274, the Prevent Exposure to Narcotics and Toxic Act of 2021, H.R. 7174, the National Computer Forensics Institute Reauthorization Act of 2022, H.R. 777, the Industrial Control Systems Cybersecurity Training Act, and H.R. 7778, the Department of Homeland Security Seal Protection Act, and H.R. 7779, the DHS Restrictions on Confucius Institutes and Chinese Entities of Concern Act. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the committee in recess at any time. With that, I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Let me begin by saying that this has been a sad week for our country. First, on Friday night in Milwaukee, 21 people were injured in a mass shooting as the city hosted the NBA playoffs. On Saturday in Buffalo, a young white man radicalized on the internet brought into great replacement conspiracy theory that immigrants and minorities are somehow going to replace white Americans, and targeted a grocery store in a predominantly black neighborhood, murdering 10 people. And on Sunday, in Laguna Woods, California, a shooter opened fire on a predominantly Taiwanese congregation meeting at a Presbyterian church. Today in America, the sad truth is that minority communities across the country have to fear grocery shopping, going to a salon, or gathering in fellowship to worship. DHS Secretary Mayorkas, FBI Director Wray, and others have been warning that domestic violent extremists pose the greatest terrorism threat to the homeland. And tragically, those warnings are becoming more evident every day. It is time we truly heed these warnings. In that vein, this committee will continue its rigorous oversight of this severe and pervasive threat. Turning to today's agenda, we are considering 5 timely measures. The first measure, H.R. 7174, authored by Representative Slotkin, would reauthorize for 10 years the National Computer Forensic Institute, or NCFI, which is the Secret Service's training center for state and local law enforcement, prosecutors, and judges to learn how to legally and effectively process computer evidence related to ransomware attacks and other computer crimes. With ransomware and cyber threats rising, the NCFI's mission is more important than ever. Without this reauthorization, the NCFI's authority to carry out its important work would sunset in November of this year. We also taken up measures that would authorize CISA to carry out training to develop and strengthen the skills of the cybersecurity workforce related to securing industrial control systems, and authorize training for CBP personnel to prevent secondary exposure to fentanyl and other potentially lethal substances. Additionally, we are considering a measure that will bolster the protection of DHS research and development from foreign malign influence operation. H.R. 7779, the DHS Restrictions on Confucius Institute and Chinese Entities of Concern Act, introduced by Representative Pfluger, aims to be responsive to what members of the committee have heard in classified briefings over recent years about the Chinese government's effort to infiltrate American colleges and universities. I worked with Mr. Pfluger on an amendment to support the goals of the underlying bill in a way that avoids making historically black colleges and universities and other minority-serving institutions choose between R&D opportunities with DHS and keeping valued cultural and language exchange programs. Specifically, my amendment limits the prohibition on funding for universities and colleges to just those that have relationships with Confucius institutions, just as the prohibition works at the Defense Department. At the same time, it would require greater transparency about contacts with other Chinese universities. I thank Congressman Pfluger for working with me on this. Finally, we'll consider my bill, H.R. 778, the Department of Homeland Security's Seal Protection Act, which would provide much-needed statutory protection for the DHS seal against misappropriation in a manner intended to convey the impression that DHS or component has approved, endorsed, or authorized such use. This legislation is a priority of the department and is responsive to the recent high-profile arrest of two individuals who cultivated law enforcement in the Secret Service and in the other federal agencies while pretending to be DHS officers. I look forward to passing these important measures. And now, a couple of administrative points. The chair reminds members participating remotely to have their cameras on during recorded votes. Recorded votes may occur at any time, but to the extent practicable, the chair will postpone requests for recorded votes until the end of legislative business. Members are further reminded that the committee will operate according to the guidelines laid out by myself and the ranking member in our February 3rd, 2021 colloquy regarding remote procedures. With that, I thank the members for their participation today, and I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Katko, for an opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for the opportunity this morning. And I echo your sentiments about what's happened over the weekend, and it's an all too familiar tragedies that are taking on a very troubling turn. Buffalo's not far from me. I went to my school there, and it's to see what happened and how it happened is very troubling. From a Homeland Security standpoint, I hope that we can get together and have some discussions about how to pursue what we can from our angle to prevent these things from happening. I will note that the perpetrator took a page out of the playbooks of bad actors in New Zealand and Norway in attempting to publicize this using the internet and various means on the internet, including live streaming the shooting itself. And the live streaming of the shooting went for almost 3 minutes before it was taken down. These entities have got to do better, and we've got to do better to stop glorifying, to some extent, or at least giving recognition to these bad actors in the media. So I'm happy to work with you and all of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to try and get to the root of this troubling problem. But clearly, the internet is fueling a lot of this, and there's a cross-pollination internationally of hate crimes and race-based crimes that is deeply troubling that we need to do more with. So with that, I remain committed to work with you on that, Mr. Chairman, and seek justice for this particular act, but also try and prevent similar ones going forward. I think we need to have a lot of frank discussions in that regard. Excuse me. Turning to our duties in this markup, I am proud of the measures put forward by everyone today, and I want to particularly point out some on the Republican side. Please speak on behalf of my friend and colleague, Representative David Joyce, for his work to address the important issue of protecting our frontline Customs and Border Protection personnel from the dangerous substances they encounter every single day. Anybody that goes to the border will tell you that. This is especially important as the situation at our southern border continues to worsen by the day under this administration. H.R. 5274, the Prevent Exposure to Narcotics and Toxics or Prevent Act, requires the CBP commissioner to issue containment devices, critical tools that provide protection against secondary exposure to fentanyl and other chemical substances to all CBP frontline personnel. In 2019, the Department of Homeland Security Office of the Inspector General issued a report concluding that CBP officers were at great risk of secondary exposure while handling illicit drugs due to inadequate protection. Every day, CBP workers work in challenging and dangerous environments to safeguard our borders. And in the course of their duties, they risk exposure through inhalation, ingestion, skin contact, and contact with needles. So far this year, CBP has seized 6,601 pounds of fentanyl alone. That's an incredible number. And this has only increased the threat of secondary exposure posed to frontline agents, as we all know the volatility of fentanyl. We must do all we can in Congress to protect our law enforcement, and first responders from secondary exposure to these deadly drugs. This legislation, introduced last year, has bipartisan support, including many members on this committee. I strongly encourage all members to support this bill and protect our frontline CBP personnel. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a statement on H.R. 5274 by the bill's sponsor, Representative Joyce.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to thank Representative Pfluger for his efforts to dismantle the Chinese governance influence in our homeland at our universities. H.R. 7779, the Department of Homeland Security restrictions on Confucius Institutes and Chinese entities of concern act, is a necessary and common sense bill that seeks to mitigate the risk posed by the Chinese Communist Party for institutions of higher education. Confucius Institutes are strategic organizations for the CCP, which masquerade as mutually beneficial sources of learning, but whose undue influence at American universities pose a grave danger. They enable the CCP to access the research and intellectual pursuits of these institutions and enable the theft of that information for the benefit of China, accelerating their attempts to usurp the United States as a leader in dozens of economic sectors and commercial markets. H.R. 7779 would ensure that no DHS science and technology or research and development funding goes to American universities that continue to maintain relationships with these clandestine Chinese entities. I don't know what it's going to take for universities, Mr. Chairman, to wake up and understand the threat that the Chinese government has with these institutes. We must prevent Chinese encroachment on our intellectual freedom and, by extension, protect our country's academic integrity and achievements. Congress has already taken important steps to similarly prohibit Department of Defense funding for universities that continue to host Confucius Institutes. It is now our turn to take action on such funding. Congress must ensure that taxpayer dollars are not going to entities that embolden our foremost adversary and undermine our national security. I therefore encourage all my colleagues to support this common sense but critically important legislation. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. I appreciate the bipartisan nature and the fact that we have bills from both sides of the aisle. Once again, going forward, I think it's a hallmark of this committee, and we stand as a shining example of bipartisanship in a very difficult situation these days in Washington. So I thank you for that, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, thank you, Ranking Member Katko. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. Without objection and by agreement between the chair and ranking member, the committee shall use an amendment roster today.
Reserving the right to object, and I will not object, would the chair please explain the agreement regarding the amendment roster? I yield to the chairman.
I thank the gentleman and all committee members for agreeing to use an amendment roster. We've agreed that the bills be open to amendment at any point and that we will take up amendments in the order listed on the roster. The chair will allow members to offer amendments listed on the roster out of order to the extent practicable and in a manner not prohibited by House or committee rules. Amendments not listed on the roster may be considered at the conclusion of consideration of the roster.
I thank the chair for this explanation and will withdraw my reservation.
Thank you very much. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 7174. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 7174 to amend the Homeland Security Act of 2002 to reauthorize the National Computer Forensics Institute of the United States Secret Service and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with and the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. It is now in order to consider the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Slotkin, now on the roster. With that purpose, for what purpose does the gentlewoman from Michigan seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 7174. Amendment in the nature of substitute to H.R. 7174 offered by Ms. Slotkin.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with and the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered base text for purpose of further amendment. The gentlewoman from Michigan is recognized for 5 minutes in support of her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I introduced H.R. 7174, the National Computer Forensics Institute Reauthorization Act, to reauthorize the Secret Service's National Computer Forensic Institute through 2032, and its current authorization will lapse in November. The NCFI is a critical federally funded training center that focuses on equipping state, local, tribal, and territorial officers, prosecutors, and judges with tools and tactics for cybercrime investigations and cyber incident response. As a former CIA officer, I know the importance of law enforcement training, particularly when it comes to emerging and digital technologies. NCFI specifically has had a great impact. Over 16,000 law enforcement officers from all 50 states and 5 U.S. territories have been trained. In Michigan, NCFI's training was instrumental in local law enforcement response to in Oakland County after we had a tragic November 2021 shooting at Oxford High School. This is in my district, and they were indispensable. To date, more than 300 officers, judges, and prosecutors in Michigan have undergone training through NCFI, and over $2.6 million in equipment has been provided to Michigan law enforcement through the program. The H.R. 7174 ensures that this great work continues and makes a number of targeted enhancements to position the NCFI for success. I think it's a great bill. I appreciate the bipartisan support, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Does any member seek recognition on the amendment in the nature of a substitute? It is now in order to consider an amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by myself on the roster. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7174 offered by Mr. Thompson.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes to explain the amendment. This is a simple amendment that would improve transparency in the nomination process for training at the National Computer Forensic Institute, or NCFI, operated by the U.S. Secret Service. The Cyber and Electronics Crime Investigative Training at NCFI is extremely popular with state, local, tribal, and territorial law enforcement, prosecutors, and judicial officers. Because of the high demand for training, potential participants must apply for the limited spots available at NCFI. This amendment would require Secret Service to report to Congress on the nomination process for education and training at NCFI, giving us better insight on NCFI's ability to achieve its mission and ensure its training reaches diverse jurisdictions throughout the United States and in as many state, local, tribal, and territorial law enforcement personnel with interests and need. I thank Congresswoman Slotkin for introducing the bill and working with me on this amendment, and I yield back. Does any member seek recognition on the amendment? If there's no further debate, the question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by the gentleman from Mississippi. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no.
Aye.
In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. There are no further amendments listed on the roster. Are there any further amendments to the measure? If not, the question on agreeing to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7174 as amended. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on reporting the bill H.R. 7174 as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. Those in favor say aye.
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 Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. A recorded vote, sorry about that. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 7777. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 7777, to amend the Homeland Security Act of 2002 to authorize the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency to establish an industrial control systems cybersecurity training initiative and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The gentleman from California, Mr. Swalwell, is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for convening this important markup. Every day, we rely upon our critical infrastructure to heat our homes, deliver clean water, fuel our cars, and to connect online. Unfortunately, malicious state actors like Russia and China continue to exploit vulnerabilities to disrupt, disconnect, and destroy the infrastructure that makes our way of life possible. As Putin and his regime become increasingly isolated and Ukraine sees more success on the battlefield, we should expect the Kremlin to become more belligerent in targeting the U.S. and our allies with unconventional cyber attacks. And China, waiting in the wings, is watching. Successful attacks have the potential to impact every element of daily life. That means everything connected to a network is a potential vulnerability. This is what we would refer to as left-of-boom vulnerabilities. And every person, small business or federal, database is a possible target. In fact, in 2021 alone, cybercrimes inflicted approximately $6 trillion in damages around the world. Attacks on industrial networks account for a huge portion of that number, and it's likely to get worse in the future. That's why I'm proud to support and introduce H.R. 7777, not just the winning numbers on a slot machine, but also the Industrial Control Systems Cybersecurity Training Act, which would make permanent an existing education initiative within the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA. Industrial control systems, also known as ICS, are critical systems that control our electrical grids, oil and gas pipelines, water and sanitation systems, public transportation networks, manufacturing facilities, and many other vital services. ICS are utilized by private companies and governments at all levels. If an ICS is compromised, it can cause massive damage and disruptions to daily life. The education program my legislation solidifies, the ICS Training Initiative, provides free, virtual, and in-person cybersecurity training to public and private security entities, including critical infrastructure, administrators, national laboratories, including nuclear laboratories, and other operators of an ICS. Training will equip information technology professionals across all levels with the tools and expertise necessary to secure against advanced persistent threats. CISA's involvement in this educational initiative is essential to defend our nation against malicious actors in cyberspace. CISA builds public-private partnerships and establishes industry best practices and security standards. The ICS training program is a great example of building public-private cooperation around cybersecurity, and it should be made permanent as a feature of CISA's work. I want to specifically note how important these services are to my district's 2 major federal research centers, Sandia and Lawrence Livermore National Labs. Their cybersecurity research and development are leveraged every day by numerous federal agencies, including CISA. I frequently hear from these labs about challenges in retaining a competitive cybersecurity workforce. They tell me that one area of focus is to deepen collaborations with other national laboratories and within the public sector. National laboratory staff in my district find great value in these exchanges, and it rewards their sense of national service. My legislation will cement these relationships, a bridge between national labs and industry that strengthens each other's cyber workforces. This bill is about protecting American interests from hostile actors before they hit us. Every national lab relies on ICS, as do state, local, and federal government infrastructures, all the way down to small businesses to manage day-to-day operations. We must invest more resources and expertise to keep our economy running and our infrastructures functioning. We must continually strengthen our cybersecurity measures across the board by hardening our defenses against exploitation. So again, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for this sensible piece of legislation that you're bringing forward today, a left-of-boom protection for our critical infrastructure. This common sense reform is an easy solution to build resilience against cyber attacks for our most vulnerable systems. And I urge swift passage of H.R. 7777, and I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Does any member seek recognition on the bill? There are no amendments listed on the roster. Are there any amendments to this measure? If not, the question now occurs on reporting the bill, H.R. 7777, without amendment to the House with a favorable recommendation. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 7778. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 7778, to amend the Homeland Security Act of 2002 to prohibit misuse of the Department of Homeland Security seal and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. It is now in order to consider the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by myself on the roster. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7778, offered by Mr. Thompson.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered base text for purpose of further amendment. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to explain the amendment. Today, I'm proud to speak on the Dhs Seal Protection Act, a simple but critically important piece of legislation I sponsored to enhance the protection of the department's seal. Since the creation of DHS in 2003, the department has used this seal to symbolize its mission and unite the 240,000 employees under one banner. The image of the DHS seal serves as a symbol of the department itself. However, the DHS seal lacks specific statutory protections needed to prohibit bad actors from exploiting it to mislead the American people and carry out crimes. These protections have been afforded to the seals of several federal departments and agencies, such as Department of Treasury and Defense, as well as the CIA. The lack of statutory protection for the DHS seal is a gap in the law. The need to protect it brought into focus just last month with 2 individuals who were charged with impersonating undercover DHS agents. They did so to gain the trust of officers within the U.S. Secret Service and exploit the trust for their own purposes. According to court documents, quote, the men were not merely playing dress-up, but engaged in conduct that represented a serious threat to the community, compromised the operation of a federal law enforcement agency, and created a potential risk to the national security, unquote. In 2018, there was a similar incident in which a criminal inappropriately used the DHS seal to misrepresent himself as a department official. It's clear that bad actors are all too willing to exploit this legal loophole, and given the department's many law enforcement missions, it's an exploitation that risks directly undermining the safety and security of our country. It does not take much imagination to come up with how transnational criminal organizations engaged in trafficking at the southern border can exploit this gap in the law to access patches and other materials with DHS's seal to misrepresent themselves and evade detection. The gap in the law not only undermines the security of the department, its misuse can give the impression of false departmental endorsement of products, including potentially harmful or faulty products. During the COVID-19 pandemic, without specific statutory protections, DHS struggled to prevent a well-known internet-based retailer from selling face masks displaying the DHS seal. According to DHS, other businesses have misled consumers, including a tornado shelter manufacturer using the seal to endorse its product, and a third-party website using the seal to advertise medical examinations. These misrepresentations trade on the respect and authority that is symbolized by the seal at the expense of the American people. My bill seeks to bolster the legal protection for the DHS seal against misappropriation and exploitation beyond those in current law. Specifically, this bill would grant the Secretary of Homeland Security the authority to prevent or pursue actions against individuals, organizations, or businesses that use the DHS seal to misrepresent endorsement or approval by the department and harm the public. Importantly, my bill clarifies the current law for users of the seal, as well as DHS officers or employees engaged in official duties would not be affected by this legislation. The effort to protect DHS's seal dates back to the 109th Congress, when my Republican colleague on the committee, Peter King, first introduced legislation to strengthen and protect the department's name, initials, insignia, and seal. That effort had bipartisan support. With its diverse national security mission, DHS needs the protection that have been granted to other federal departments and law enforcement agencies. Now is the time for the members of this committee to advance this bipartisan effort and support this legislation, granting DHS the authority it needs to stop bad actors. I thank my colleagues for supporting this bill and yield back the balance of my time. Does any member seek recognition on the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
I do, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wonder if the chairman would yield to a question. I was just quickly looking. I guess the concern I have is would the bill affect the ability of, say, somebody doing satire on a satirical meme on the internet using the seal of DHS? Would that be prohibited by this?
You're talking about just to put it and say, like, give me an example.
Well, I don't know I don't know if I can think of an example, but if someone, let's say the Babylon Bee posts a thing and purports to be in a satirical fashion an announcement of the Department of Homeland Security that they're going to crack down on free speech, for example, but you can tell by reading it's a parody, but it uses the DHS seal. Would this render that unconstitutional or illegal?
Not in that case.
Well, and let me ask one more question if I can, and I would. If you would, Mr. Chairman, I just quickly, because I was wondering if this, it struck me that to have a separate law specifically for the DHS seal at this late date is sort of it begs question for me why this isn't, to the extent it needs to be dealt with, why it hadn't been dealt with before. So I quickly did a search in the Criminal Code of the United States, Section 912, whoever falsely assumes or pretends to be an officer or employee acting under the authority of the United States or any department, agency, or officer thereof, et cetera, can be convicted of crime and fined or imprisoned. Why is that not adequately provided for there?
Well, the adequacy is that it's not specifically referenced DHS. We're the youngest agency in government, and we're just protecting the integrity of this agency by preventing anyone from unlawfully using the seal.
One more question, Mr. Chairman, if you would. You said Peter King offered this before and it didn't advance. What were the objections at that time? I, of course, wasn't a member of the committee.
Well, it advanced out of the committee.
I see.
Right.
All right.
It passed.
Thank you,
Unanimously.
Mr. Chairman, for those. I guess my only last comment, and I don't know, is my time expired or did I get time?
Mr. Chairman. No.
Let me just finish. Last point is to say, I have some reticence about it because I do think, especially coming off the heels of the recent thing with DHS and the sort of the embarrassment over the disinformation board, I'm concerned about ways in which we unduly restrict the public or attempt to kind of command respect for government agencies that sometimes is not earned. It does seem to me the criminal code already provides for that somebody actually engaged in impersonating federal authority is subject to criminal prosecution under existing code provision. So I'm unpersuaded respectfully that this is the right thing to do, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Louisiana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I share my colleague's initial concern, perhaps a word of reassurance on the bill. My research shows that the DHS has no explicit enforcement authority under the bill, and elements of a crime reflective of some furtherance of the intent to used the symbol and the emblem of DHS in the act of committing a crime of impersonation would call for reasonable suspicion for investigation, and then if the investigation would lead to probable cause for arrest, and that individual would be subject to prosecution for that crime. But this bill gives DHS no explicit authority for enforcement. It just sets the standard where a criminal act could be investigated if there was a furtherance of intent to use the symbol of DHS for the committing of some other crime, some level of crime. I yield, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, let me just say that, let me kind of read it out for you. DHS needs the legislation because it would provide them the only non-criminal protection for the seal. This would allow DHS to stop third parties from selling products that use the seal before those products are used in criminal activity, claiming DS endorsement and/or sponsorship for the material. So, I mean, that's kind of the essence of it. There are no further amendments listed on the roster. Are there any further amendments to the measure? If not, the question is on agreeing to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7778. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
And those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, an amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on reporting the bill, H.R. 778, and as amended to the House floor with a favorable recommendation. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion is carried. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 7779. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 7779 to establish Department of Homeland Security funding restrictions on institutions of higher education that have a relationship with Confucius Institutes and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Pfluger, is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Katko for bringing this critical piece of legislation before the committee. And I appreciate the bipartisan nature in which we've worked on this, because it is truly, I think, in our national security interest to address it. The Chinese Communist Party, working through the People's Liberation Army, has for years executed propaganda and espionage campaigns across the globe. And of particular concern is the CCP's practice of exploiting the open and collaborative nature of American academia in an effort to conduct widespread industrial and military espionage inside the United States. Confucius Institutes were first established in America in 2005, marketed by the CCP as a mechanism to promote Chinese language and culture, to support local Chinese teaching internationally and facilitate cultural exchanges. It quickly became apparent that Confucius Institutes were an extension of the CCP's global influence apparatus, allowing it to impact the decisions of academic institutions and spy inside the United States. In May of 2020, Zihao Kong, a Chinese student at Purdue University, posted a letter online commemorating the victims of the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre. What followed was truly catastrophic. Officers of the Ministry of State Security, the primary Chinese civilian spy agency, visited Zihao's parents in China to pressure them to stop his activist activity inside the United States. Other Chinese students at Purdue began to harass Kong, threatening to report him to the embassy. After his parents were repeatedly visited by MSS officers, Kong was silenced, rescinding his commitment to speak at a forum on the Tiananmen massacre. The fact that the CCP was able to suppress free speech and debate inside the United States campuses is gravely concerning. Purdue University is a school that receives DHS science and technology funding, hosted a Confucius Institute until 2018, and had extensive ties with Chinese schools, Chinese universities, promoting military-civil fusion as recently as 2021. It is past time that we take a strong stance against the CCP's violation of U.S. academia, and it starts with ensuring that DHS funding only goes to institutions that are free from Chinese foreign influence. The United States government has taken some successful action against this encroachment in the last few years. The fiscal year 2021 NDAA prohibited DoD funding from going to institutions of higher education that host Confucius Institutes. The time is now for the Department of Homeland Security to take similar action. Under no circumstances should a school inside the U.S. be allowed to receive DHS funding while tacitly accepting CCP's money that comes with the price tag of fealty. My bill, H.R. 7779, the DHS Restrictions on Confucius Institutes Act, ensures that schools prioritize the security of their scientific research and technological development efforts above a paycheck from the CCP. It restricts institutions of higher education from receiving DHS funding while hosting Confucius Institutes or continuing lucrative relationships with Chinese universities that promote military-civil fusion. Military-civil fusion is the CCP's aggressive national strategy to help the PRC develop the most technologically advanced military in the world, and often the theft of American intellectual property. This bill ensures taxpayer dollars are appropriately used and encourages universities to end relationships with partners who do not have America's best interest in mind. More importantly, this bill ensures U.S. institutions are free from foreign influence and safe from the theft of their very important research and development. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Katko for bringing this bill to the floor, and I urge the committee to vote yes on this measure. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does any member seek recognition on the bill?
Mr. Chairman,
Gentleman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
it was,
Colonel, I appreciate you bringing this to the committee. We investigated in South Carolina, found two colleges, one University of South Carolina, one my alma mater, Presbyterian. They're doing it because they're paying, you had people coming in, professors going to one major and then switch over. What they're doing now, and I guess my question is, how do we prevent, we got it outlawed in both, but they changed the names, and so you couldn't detect it. Is there anything that, in your opinion, we could do to make sure that's not happening? Because it was listed under Confucius Institute, and the dollars that flowed were pretty brazen. Now, it's, from what we understand, it's just, all it is changing the name of it, but you got students coming in here, money's going to flow into the universities and the colleges. How do we, does your bill prevent that? I yield back.
Well, yeah.
I yield my time.
Thank you. It's a great question, and I think that's the danger. This is an important first step, and I think that's the way we should look at it, is this first step towards identifying where those dollars are coming from, the institutions inside China that are paying the money, and whether it's a Confucius Institute or any other name, we have to be aware, like the DoD has been aware, of those that are on an entity list or are named in an effort to subvert or to use those dollars for other than what they're saying they're being used for. And again, I think it's a first step, and I think, Mr. Chairman, this is a conversation that we'll have to continue because there is a real threat, and the research and development that we're doing right here we can't afford to let it be hijacked or used for other national security measures. Yield back.
Thank you very much. And the gentleman is from South Carolina, by the way. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. Pfluger, for doing this bill. I think it's a good one, and I think any of us who are on HASC voted on this provision for the Department of Defense, I think with the clarifying amendment that Mr. Thompson ordered. But I will say we are certainly not settled on how to deal with the influence of the Chinese government on our campuses, and whether it's renaming things or just finding other cutouts and other ways to bring that money in. I don't think we're settled as a country on how to deal with it. University of Michigan had one of these centers until 2019. Michigan State, which I represent, had one until 2021. And my guess is there's not less interest from the Chinese government on how to influence those campuses. So, but at the same time, we want to be a place that's open to the most talented people in the world, and we want those people to come here, bring their ideas, start their companies, and become good, contributors. So I would just offer that I agree we need to take a more comprehensive, it is a great first step, but we need a more comprehensive look. And for me, the framework is if in any form or fashion the Chinese government is funding something on our campuses, that should be a major red flag, just like it would have been during the Soviet Union, the Cold War, if the Soviet Union were to do that. So it's a good first step. I support it with the clarifying amendment, but we clearly need to take this on, I think, in a more comprehensive way.
Right, and let me just say that I'll have a clarifying amendment to support Mr. Fluid shortly. Mr. Guest.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Norman, just in response to your question, the bill does, Mr. Pfluger did a great job of making sure that it expands outside of just Confucius institutions. If you look under the definitional sections, it talks about Chinese entities of concern, and then it lists out 5 different descriptions of what those would be, including those that receive funding from the Central Military Commission or CCP. Those that participate in Chinese defense industrial bases. So I think your question was, we've got these entities, they were called Confucius Institutes, now they've just changed their name and they're called something else. I think Mr. Pfluger addresses that in this bill, and that it includes other organizations that are being funded by China that are on our college campuses that are up to nefarious purposes. And so I just wanted to make clarity of that I do believe that this bill does address that. I think we need to continue to look at this. I agree this is a great first step, and want to thank August for introducing this bill, and glad to see that when this bill was being drafted that they did take that into consideration so that they can't just change their name to something else and try to get around the consequences that are addressed here in this legislation. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the ranking member from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Congressman Pfluger for this most important bill, and I appreciate all my colleagues' comments on this so far. And I adopt them and I agree with them. Something that we haven't really discussed, but we need to be mindful of, is that these Confucius Institutes do attempt to influence policy in the United States and how the Chinese Communist Party is viewed. But it's also a vehicle through which they're able to steal intellectual property writ large. Many times members of these Confucius Institutes are involved in research projects on American campuses, and we all know that American campuses and universities are often the breeding ground for wonderful innovations in technology and in public safety and national security. So this goes far beyond just their attempt to influence things in the United States. And it goes to the heart of what they're oftentimes doing, is stealing our intellectual property and getting access to national security type information that benefits them back home. So many members that are over here with the Confucius Institute are also members of the Communist Party. I would say probably the majority of them are. So this is a profound problem, and I'm troubled by universities who haven't woken up to this danger so far. I know authorities throughout our great country go to these campuses on a regular basis to give them warnings, give them heads up, give them background on why these are there and what they are attempting to do. And some of these universities don't heed the warning. Sometimes it's strictly for financial reasons. Other times it's for misplaced altruistic reasons. But whatever the reason, we got to wake up to the fact that the Communist Party is here not as our friends. They have an alternative plan. They have a 50-year plan that is not charitable to the United States, and this is part of that plan. So I wholeheartedly support this, and I think we need to look at more legislation like this to make sure our country is as secure as it can be from the Chinese threat, which is very real and very serious. I yield back.
Ranking member yields back. Let me just say that some of us have participated in classified briefings that has kind of highlighted this significant challenge and concern by those agencies. So it is a good bill, and we've been working with Mr. Pfluger to fine-tune some other aspects of it. It's now in order to consider an amendment offered by myself on the roster. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 7779, offered by Mr. Thompson.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes to explain the amendment. Over the last decade, the People's Republic of China has poured hundreds of millions of dollars into United States universities through Confucius Institutes and other means to buy influence, interfere with academic freedom and speech, and steal intellectual property and information technology research. Recognizing that this as a security risk, in 2018, Congress restricted Department of Defense funding to universities that host a Confucius Institute, resulting in the closure of several institutes. I thank Congressman Pfluger for his bill, which would similarly restrict Department of Homeland Security research and development funding, further stemming the undue Chinese influence. I also appreciate his efforts to expand the prohibition more broadly to Chinese entities of concern, including any university that has ties to the Chinese military or receiving funding from the Chinese Communist Party. My amendment aims to ensure greater transparency through the relationship between U.S. institutions of higher education and Chinese entities while preserving beneficial cultural and educational exchanges, particularly among historically black colleges and universities and other minority-serving institutions. Specifically, my amendment would require any U.S. institution of higher education that is seeking any science and technology or research development funds from DHS to disclose any relationship with a Chinese entity. Disclosure must certify the Chinese entity as well as describe the relationship in question, including the monetary value of any gift or donation made. This transparency will provide DHS greater visibility into how these agreements function and any potential influence from the Chinese government they result. Recognizing that this disclosure may place an undue and additional burden upon universities, my amendment further requires that DHS proactively provide technical assistance to colleges and universities in carrying out this requirement, and it pays particular attention to HBCUs and other minority-serving institutions, which are often too overburdened and underfunded already. Further, this amendment grants the DHS Secretary flexibility on a case-by-case basis to waive the funding prohibition on institutions with relationships with Confucius Institution under certain circumstances. I support Mr. Pfluger's bill, which seeks to help address the threat posed by the People's Republic of China. It recognizes the need to protect America's intellectual property as well as the academic freedom and freedom of speech that are cornerstones of our democracy. Both the bill and my amendment demonstrate the committee's commitment to ensuring those principles are protected. With that, I hope my colleagues will join me in supporting this important legislation. Does any member seek recognition on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I'm looking at this bill and I'm saying I agree with what it has in it, but I'm looking at the amendment and I'm seeing that the amendment, the very first portion of it, it strikes page 3, beginning line 15, strike or Chinese entity of concern, and then page 3, line 20, it strikes or Chinese entity of concern, as the case may be. Yet the original bill does a phenomenal job of describing what Chinese entity of concern is. You know, any university or college of the People's Republic of China, you know, that's involved in the implementation of military-civil fusion, participates in the Chinese Defense Industrial Base, is affiliated with Chinese state Administration for Science, Technology, Industry for the National Defense receives funding for any organization subordinate to the Chinese Military Commission or the Chinese Communist Party. It does a great job. Why would we want to strike or Chinese entity of concern? I see that as kind of going backwards. I think those words need to stay in the original bill. It keeps it strong.
No, the only thing that's a disclosure requirement that my amendment requires.
Well, I see the disclosure, but you're striking the or Chinese entity of concern from the original bill on page 3, line 15, and page 3, line 20. And I think that to keep the bill strong, that those words need to stay. Would the gentleman consider eliminating those portions from his amendment?
Well, the definition is still in the bill. It does not change the definition.
Well, what it does is it says, it says the Secretary of Homeland Security shall ensure that an institute of higher education, referred to in this section as an institution, which has a relationship with a Confucius Institute, and then it says, or Chinese entity of concern. So I think both of those need to be in there to cover the entire gambit of what's necessary.
Staff just reaffirmed the definition is still in the bill.
Well, I agree, but you're taking out the actual, yes, the definition is explained, but you're taking out that wording that refers to the definition.
That's not true.
Well, it's striking it. It strikes our Chinese entity.
It's still in the base bill.
I disagree, sir.
Well,
it's right
that's your
there
interpretation.
in page 3, and it says it strikes it. So I see that when you strike it, it's weakening the bill.
Well, the definition is there. It changes from a prohibition to a disclosure.
And I think the prohibition should stay.
That's your opinion.
It is.
Any other member? The gentleman yields back.
I yield.
Any other member seeks recognition? Is there no further?
Chairman,
debate?
it's Congressman Van Drew. I just wanted to speak on that for a moment.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I just wanted to express that I agreed with Mr. Clyde on this. If it's in the bill and if it is not of import, why not leave it as it was? If you agree that it's in the bill and you agree that it's not a problem, then why don't we just leave it as it was and all agree to be happy with that, since it's not a major change? I think that certainly is something that would be allowable and certainly something that could be productive for all of us where we work together to agree upon something. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the amendment? If there's no further debate, the question on agreeing to the amendment offered by the gentleman from Mississippi. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. There are no further amendments listed on the roster. Are there any further amendments to the measure? If not, the question now occurs on reporting the bill H.R. 7779 as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 5274. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 5274, to amend the Homeland Security Act of 2002 to provide training for U.S. Customs and Border Protection personnel on the use of containment devices to prevent secondary exposure to fentanyl and other potentially lethal substances and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. Does any member seek recognition on the bill? There are no amendments listed on the roster. Are there any amendments to the measure? If not, the question now occurs on reporting the bill, H.R. 5274, without amendment to the House with a favorable recommendation. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. The ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Without objection, staff is authorized to make any required technical or conforming changes to reflect the actions of the committee. Without objection, the measure amended during today's markup will be reported to the House in the form of one amendment in the nature of a substitute for each bill. This concludes the consideration of the bills noticed by the committee for today.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, I ask that members have 2 calendar days to file with the clerk of the committee supplemental, additional, or minority views on each of the bills ordered reported by the committee today.
So ordered. There being no further business before the committee, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.